What's up, chess players? In today's video, I'm going to share my 5 best tips for avoiding stalemate. If you're new to chess or even a more experienced player, you've likely accidentally stalemated your opponent in a totally winning position, and that feeling sucks. So I've collected my best ideas to help you avoid that situation and come out on top. For tip number 1, we're going to develop a stalemate radar. What does that mean? Well, it means we know exactly what stalemate is and is not, and when the position has certain properties, we can be extra careful to avoid stalemate, and there are other positions where stalemate is much less likely and we can basically disregard it from our calculation. So let's take a look at a few positions and start developing that radar for where stalemate is likely and where it's not likely. So who better to teach us about stalemate than the stalemate king himself, XQC? So we're going to take a look at some of his games here. Scroll down and filter by stalemate. Let's see if we get some results here. You can see he's got 52 games that ended in stalemate. And let's just take a look at the first game. Alright, so XQC only had a second and a half here. We got to cut him a little slack. So it's black to move here, or it would be, but it's actually a draw. Why is that? Well, one, black has no legal moves. In this case, black only has a king, so we're only considering the king. But in other positions, if you had other pieces, you have to have no legal moves for any of your pieces. And here, because there's just the king, the black king is actually cut off from all of its possible squares because of the white king and queen. So if we look at the squares attacked by the queen, they're covering these squares, and then the white king is also covering this square, so black has no legal moves. However, it's not checkmate. And the reason it's not checkmate is white is not threatening to take black's king. In other words, black is not in check. And that's the other important property for stalemate. So black has no legal moves and is not in check in this position, and that is a draw in chess. So how do we develop that stalemate radar? Well, let's look at a couple other positions and see some of the common themes that result in a stalemating position. So here's another example of stalemate, and it would be black to move, but it's stalemate. What's something you notice about this position? Well, one, white has a huge crushing material advantage. And the other thing is that black only has their king. So when one side has a huge material advantage and another side has just their king, that's one of the first conditions that should be triggering that stalemate radar. So you got to be extra careful when the enemy side only has the king, because it's very easy to accidentally block off that king. And that's exactly what's happening here. So you can see this rook is cutting off the king from this side. The queen is cutting him off from this side. And then we got the bishop helping in here. So now the king is just blocked in from all sides. Has no legal moves, but still not check. So this is going to be stalemate. So interesting enough, if black just had one piece lying around that had a legal move, so let's say just a random pawn somewhere on the board, it's no longer stalemate, because this pawn has some legal moves. So as long as the other side has a legal move, just one, that's all you need, it's not going to be stalemate. So looking at one more example XQC stalemate game, we see a slightly different pattern. You'll see again, black only has a king, but this time, instead of being blocked in by a queen, it's just the king and pawn combo that's keeping the king locked in the corner, but not giving check. So remember, pawns attack diagonally, so this king is not threatened, it's not in check, and white's king is covering this square and defending this pawn, so the black king is locked in there. So that's another thing to look out for when your pawns are sort of blockading the enemy king stuck in the corner or just the side of the board. That's another common stalemate pattern. Just going to look at one more example of stalemate patterns. You'll notice here the black pawns are blocking in white's pawns, and that is one other property to look for when you're developing your stalemate radar. So if you have a locked pawn structure, one side often can have no legal moves. So in this case, white's pawns are stuck. So even though they're there, no legal moves. And we have a similar situation to the last stalemate where black's king is defending the pawn in front of white's king. And white is stalemated here. No legal moves, and this is a draw. All right, so to repeat, some of those things to look out for when you're developing your stalemate radar: a lone enemy king, locked pawn structure, and a massive material advantage for one side. Those are some of the ingredients that sort of brew a stalemate. So if you see those in the position, slow down a bit and try to be extra careful to avoid stalemate. All right, now that we've developed that stalemate radar, let's look at some specific tips and ways you can avoid entering those positions in the first place. So we mentioned that positions where one side has a massive material advantage and the other side has locked pawns or just their king is something to look out for. Well, we can avoid that. If we're the side that has a huge material advantage, we don't have to munch up every single piece. If we give our opponent a few extra pieces on the board, they're going to make sure that it's not stalemate. All right, so here's an example game that ended in stalemate, and white XQC just munches up everything. You know, just no holds barred, just trying to destroy the guy. Now, that can work if you're a precise calculator, but if you're a beginner new to the game, it just makes it way more complicated for yourself. Just leave some of these pawns and the bishop on the board. They're not doing anything. Here you could probably just take your A pawn, run it all the way up the board, and get an easy queen and then checkmate. And as long as that bishop has some legal moves, it's not going to be stalemate. So that's the easiest approach. Instead, white munches up literally everything, and we end up in a stalemate position. It's just really sad to see. Some of this can stem from a lack of ability to checkmate or a lack of confidence in your checkmating ability. So you want as many queens as possible to deliver checkmate, but that also increases your chances of stalemating. So just practice those checkmating patterns. Calm down a bit once you're up in material. If you've got a full piece or two-piece advantage, you don't need to take every single pawn. That's just going to increase your chances of stalemating your opponent. Our third tip for avoiding stalemate is learning when to cut off the enemy king. It can really simplify how you avoid stalemate. So for example, in an endgame with just your king and queen and you're trying to deliver checkmate, once you get their king to the side of the board, you want to just cut off their king entirely by just placing your queen on this file, and now the king only has these legal moves. We'll just keep shuffling back and forth, and you can almost just pre-move this checkmate. They're going to have to move up here. You just bring your king in. The king is never going to be close enough to prevent the enemy king from having some legal moves, and eventually you're going to be able to deliver that checkmate. Now, if possible, if you can achieve this kind of position, this is kind of the ideal state. So the enemy king only has two squares. They're just going to shuffle back and forth between a7 and a8 here. And you're going to be able to pull your king in and then just deliver checkmate. So this is a no-brainer, a technique often used in bullet. So if you can get that perfect 2x4 box with your queen and really lock their king in there, you're going to be able to deliver checkmate. For my fourth tip, sometimes your biggest strength, having a ton of material, is actually a weakness and can result in stalemate. So if you have a ton of queens, it's very easy to deliver stalemate accidentally. So one way to solve this is actually massive simplification. So if you are in a position where the enemy king is just alone by itself running around the board, just throw those pawns away. Let your opponent take them. That's fine. That's going to simplify the position for you. And if you let your opponent take most of your pieces, then you should be totally confident with just a king and queen checkmate, and the risk of stalemate is a lot lower once you get some of those pieces off the board. Finally, the fifth technique, and probably the simplest and most noob technique, but it does work, is the always be checking strategy. So once you've reached an endgame like this, just deliver check on every single move. That's going to minimize the chances of you accidentally stalemating your opponent. So just because you have a massive material advantage, you can still accidentally stalemate your opponent. Just make sure you're just giving check on every move. And as I said with the previous tip, it's okay to simplify. So if you have 3 queens or 2 queens on the board, it's okay to give up one. That's fine. You're still going to be able to give checkmate in the end. So don't worry so much about preserving every single one of your pieces. Just focus on always be checking, and it's okay to simplify. Alright, so to recap, our 5 tips for avoiding stalemate. Number 1, developing a stalemate radar. Know what stalemate looks like. Have a sense for when stalemate is possible in the position. That's going to happen when the opponent has little material, when you have a ton of material, and sometimes when there are locked pawn structures. Those are things to look out for. When you see that, be careful and apply the other tips. Tip number 2, stop taking all your opponent's pieces. You don't need to take every last pawn and bishop and rook in order to win. It's okay if you let your opponent just have one piece that just shuffles around the board doing nothing. Still want to be careful, still want to calculate, but again, if you have a massive material advantage, and that's the most common scenario I'm describing, you're a beginner, you have like 4 queens on the board, you don't need that. You don't need to take all your opponent's pieces. You can give checkmate and just give them something, some little piece to shuffle around the board so it's not stalemate. Number 3, cut off the enemy king if they let you. So in a position like this, when you've got your queen, you can trap their king in a box and just place it on this file. That's going to prevent them from moving on all these squares, and now they're just going to shuffle around up and down here. You're going to be able to run your king up the board without even thinking and checkmate them with no risk of stalemate. So that's a good technique when you've got just a king and a queen and you're trying to deliver checkmate. Lock their king in a box in the corner of the square and cut it off. And for number 4, we got to simplify that position. You don't need 3 queens to deliver checkmate. You don't need a rook, a queen, a knight, and all these pawns to deliver checkmate. You can easily just throw some of them away, simplify the position, use our previous tip, lock their king in a box on the side of the board, promote your pawns, and deliver checkmate. And if all else fails, you can use tip 5, which is always be checking. If you have a huge material advantage, just give check on every turn. You're going to win. Very hard to accidentally stalemate if it's just the enemy king. Just keep giving check. Playing a waiting move in this type of a position is just asking for stalemate. So don't do that. Well, that's it for my 5 tips for avoiding stalemate. I hope you learned something, and I hope you don't play like XQC. If you like this type of content, definitely hit that subscribe button. I really appreciate your support. And also, I've got another series analyzing beginner chess games if you're interested, so go check that out. Till next time, see y'all.